Line's good.
Never on.
Whoa.
Hard. Hardly.
Come on, Brent. Line's good. Got real close.
The hair high, right?
Try and hit 2/3.
Have they saved it for her? Yes, they have.
Welcome to Game of Stones, everybody. I am Sean Graham Scott, alongside, as always, hello, Scott.
Hey, Sean.
How you doing, buddy?
I'm pretty good. Pretty good.
The start of week 2 of no going to work for both of us.
Yeah. I did have a phone call or two this afternoon that I was able to get some information and then relay some of that information, as is my job. But well,
congratulations on doing your job.
So I was able to do my job. I felt more useful than I have over the last week or so.
That's good. That's very good. Certainly my team, in the realm of what is essential and what isn't essential, a group of historians who generally work on their own projects. We can work remotely. A couple of people on the team that I work with already do that on a daily basis. They don't come into the office. So we have a Google chat going that's sort of firing off all day. A lot of communication back and forth. We had a meeting last week where one person couldn't figure out or didn't want to, or I don't know what was going on, the video. We were going to do a Google Hangout for it, but she couldn't for whatever reason. So we had the phone call going, but we also did Google Hangout, and everyone was on mute on Hangout, and we were on the phone conferencing system because we felt that it'd still be good to see everybody. So we have another. We're going to keep doing stuff like that. So hope everyone out there is making the most of this situation as best you can. And we're here, Scott. We're after this episode, unless like other things happen, I think we're done on this show talking about it. One, we're not experts on it, and two, I think we can provide a bit of a distraction from what is going on in the world.
Yes, I think that's a good idea because well, it's not that interesting to hear about us sitting at home.
It's not. You're absolutely right. So let's get into it. We're going to talk a little bit today about the Canadian Olympic Committee's decision not to send athletes to the Olympic Games in Tokyo this summer if they take place, and what, if any, ramifications that could have on Beijing 2022. So yesterday, this is Monday night as we're recording, and yesterday, Sunday night, the Canadian Olympic Committee, Scott, announced that they are not going to send athletes to the 2020 Olympic Games should they take place as scheduled in Tokyo. First of all, what was your initial reaction to that announcement?
I thought that Canada was doing a good job at being a leader in this sort of decision. It's pretty clear to me that people shouldn't be thinking about, focusing on their training or focusing on winning a gold medal instead of focusing on keeping everybody safe. And I thought this was sort of inevitable, but I was a little surprised that it came first from the Canadian Olympic Committee as opposed to the IOC itself.
Yeah, I agree. And I tweeted from the Game of Stones account that I was surprised that Canada was the first. I was also surprised that a national Olympic committee went against the IOC.
Yeah.
That does not happen.
It's pretty unprecedented for sure.
Yeah, so today or overnight, so Monday, overnight Sunday in Canada and North America, Monday in Australia, the Australian Olympic Committee also withdrew. So 2 countries are out. I also tweeted, though, Scott, that this doesn't quite apply to Australia, but for Canada, if this was a Winter Games, Canada withdrawing has a much bigger impact on the IOC than does Canada withdrawing from a Summer Games. So that's another reason I was surprised that Canada was the first. I would have thought that for Summer Games, you take a country that, I mean, the United States in the Summer Games, that's the key. That is the linchpin. If the United States is out, this is not going to happen.
Mm-hmm. I saw also that Russia said, "Oh, we support it," but I thought Russia was banned.
Yeah, Russia is banned.
So like, I see. Oh, wow, good. They're in complete support of the plan of maintaining the course.
Olympics.
Cool.
Yeah. Oh, they're in support of having the Olympics.
Right, but who cares?
Right. I guess they just want to mess with everybody. I don't know. Who knows what's going on with Russia? So the offshoot of this. So then today, Dick Pound, the Canadian or one of the Canadian representatives on the IOC, longtime head of the World's Anti-Doping Association. He's been involved with the Olympic movement pretty much his whole career. He had an interview first with USA Today where he basically said that the Olympics were going to be postponed to 2021. Has since been interviewed by a variety of other outlets. The International Olympic Committee has said no. That's his interpretation, and we are still going to take our time to make a decision. I have no idea what to make of all this, but I will say that, in my time paying attention to Olympic sport, Dick Pound doesn't get a lot of stuff wrong. So I'm going to roll with Dick Pound on this one.
Yeah, and I mean, does anybody think that it's a great idea to bring athletes from literally every country in the world to one spot for 2 weeks?
Well, except for Russia.
Well, I think they can still compete, but they can't compete under the flag.
The athletes can still go. Yes.
So true. Yeah, I mean, nobody thinks that's a good idea right now, and I mean, you're right. Dick Pound's not wrong about a lot of stuff. So I foresee this coming, but so let's say it does happen that the Olympics are canceled or postponed. Sean, you did some research today into how this works financially for the athletes and the Olympics as a whole. Do you have any thoughts about that?
Yeah, so I have a lot of thoughts about this because when this announcement was made, and I thought about it for a while, and it occurred to me today that if the Olympic Games are postponed to 2021 and they run them in July, August 2021 in Tokyo, what is the ramifications of that as it relates to 2022 in Beijing and any subsequent games after that? We saw that there's a precedent for shifting. In 92, this isn't when it made in 92, but to go opposite years for winter summer. Yeah. So there was the 92 and then those 94 games in Lillehammer. So there's this precedent to shift around if you need to do that. So is it possible that we go into odd number years for Olympic Games? That seems like a bit of a stretch to me. But there's also the reality that these things are expensive, not only for the host cities who tend to get hosed in the deal, but for the Olympic committees themselves. So I was curious, could Canada and could the COC conceivably have consecutive Olympic years? And simultaneously, is it possible that the lack of an Olympic this year or an Olympic Games this year, could it potentially hurt athletes, not only those summer athletes for 2021 financially, but potentially roll into 2022 and Beijing? So, go ahead.
So yeah, there, like you said, there's precedent, and that you've done some work on if they did it in consecutive years. I'm interested what if they offset everything by 2 years? What if they go back to having winter and summer together? But those are questions that we can think about while we listen to you talk about what you're talking about.
So the logistics, of course, are very challenging, more so for the summer games than for the winter games, right? The summer games are awarded through the end of the decade. right? 2024 in Paris, 2028 in Los Angeles. Doesn't seem like anybody wants 2026, the Winter Games, but we'll see what happens with that. So there's a little more flexibility around the winter than the summer, and of course the Summer Games bring in a lot more money and a lot more people because there's more events. So for Canada and the way Canada's structure works, and I only looked at Canada, I didn't look at any other country, so my apologies for other countries. But in Canada, the Canadian Olympic Committee is funded primarily through Sport Canada, which gets its money through the Department of Heritage. So the vast majority of the funding that is filtered through athletes does come from the federal government. So you have programs like Own the Podium, which provides money to individuals for winning medals, right? If you win a gold medal, you get more than a silver, and a silver is more than a bronze. And they're also identifying people who they think have a chance at winning gold medals. And this is done through a variety of metrics, including world championship performance. So if you get a certain ranking or you have a certain performance at a world championship, you get an amount of money for that. So winning world championships has value, monetary value, beyond what you would get for winning it from the international association. But the majority of this money is coming from the Department of Heritage and then filtered through these organizations. So it is very unlikely that the government would claw back any of this money in the 2020 budget, which in Canada now has been delayed because of this, or the 2021 budget, which would fund athletes through the 2022 Olympic Games. So in that respect, it is very, very unlikely that anything would change. But what's interesting to me, at least, in reading all this, is the corporate sponsorships. So while the majority of the money does come from the federal government, the Canadian Olympic Committee has a variety of corporate partners that they work with. And I think the most notable of these is Petro-Canada and Suncor. So their contract runs through the end of 2024. But as we've seen with other sports, it really depends on how these contracts are written. Because if there is a provision in the contract that says that Suncor and Petro-Canada does not have to pay the Olympic Committee if there's no Olympic Games, which if I was a lawyer for Petro-Canada, it seems like a reasonable thing to put in a contract, then that could really be damaging to the COC. Not the athletes themselves, potentially, but for the organization as a whole in running and all the administrative things that go along with that. So, Petro-Canada, I think, is the biggest partner, but you have a variety of partners across the country, and that, I think, Scott, is where the rubber could hit the road with this. If there's no games this year, how are those contracts affected? And are these companies going to be okay with maintaining the relationship through a potential 2021 Olympic Games and then going right into, because the 2022 Games, Scott, would be 6 months later if this gets delayed, postponed to 2021. Would they want to either defer some of their money that goes to the summer athletes and put them into winter athletes, or vice versa? Would they, because they're going to be so close together, want to put more into the summer games versus the winter games? I mean, neither of them are great in terms of advertising for Canada, just time zone wise, both being in Asia. So I don't know if that really factors into it. I mean, if one of them was in North America and one was in Asia, and these organizations had a choice, they're putting way more advertising into the North American one just because of the time zones. So all of this, I think, from a macro level of the Olympic movement and the way this thing gets funded, there's a lot of unanswered questions. And I think one of the reasons why the IOC is, you could argue, dragging their feet on this, it's not because they don't know that they should postpone the Olympic Games. It's that each country has relationships like this, where athletes are funded by governments, there are corporate partners, at these national levels, certainly the IOC has their partners. You have television partners in every country around the world that air the Olympics and have specific requirements from their advertisers. The logistics of this are so huge. I think that's why there hasn't been an announcement yet. And for the COC now, they are going to have to figure out logistically, how do you put together two Olympic delegations that will go off to Asia and Paralympic delegations that will go within 6 months of each other. The logistics of this are huge and incredibly expensive.
Yeah, pretty expensive. One of the things you mentioned was the sponsor, Petro-Canada and Suncor.
Yep.
I don't know if you've been walking by a gas station anytime lately, Sean, but today I noticed that gas was 67 cents, which I haven't seen since I was a kid. Whether Petro-Canada and Suncor are even going to have money to be able to fulfill these contracts of sponsorship is another question, right? So yeah, this really throws everything into flux. Another thing about timing, right? A lot of people are saying, oh, well, you could just postpone until the fall. Maybe that would help. But then for television partners, you run up against other things. We saw the Rugby World Cup was in Japan this past September and October, and there was at least 2 games canceled due to typhoons. They just went in the books as draws, which got Canada its only non-loss of the tournament. But so there's so many things that are all working together and seem to be working against hosting this tournament until at least 2021. And then all of the things you spoke about come into play. Do you know, Sean, if the contract is through 2024, the end of the Olympics in 2024, athletes right now are getting money based on their ability to get a medal through on the podium in 2020.
Yep. And 2022 for the winter athletes.
And so extending that money to 2021, does that put in jeopardy what you think, like the 2024 money?
It could, right? It certainly could open up that door of what happens in 2024. Yeah, three Olympics in 4 years is a lot to pay for. There's a story on the CBC today. Donna Spencer wrote talking about the outreach now that the COC is doing. Thomas Hall, who was a canoeist at the Olympics, who won a bronze medal in 2008. He heads the program Game Plan, which offers financial training to Olympic athletes. And based on what's in the story here, it says that most of their training, most of their services go to athletes once they retire from their sport. But then now they're rolling it out and trying to consult with athletes who are in the midst of their careers, because one of the realities is that if you're an on the podium athlete, right, the funding you get, if you're a carded Olympic athlete, the funding you get is not enough to sustain yourself. Right? You rely on winning money out on the whatever circuit you're on, right? Like if you're a skier, right? There's an interview here with one of the beach volleyball players. Right? Winning or the results in those events earn money for you as well, as do corporate sponsorships. But in this case, dollars go away. So in addition to the logistics on the macro level of, does Petro-Canada and Suncor, what's their appetite to continue paying for this? Maybe they're locked in until 2024, but what happens after 2024? But at a micro level, you have these athletes now who, training to be a high-level Olympic athlete is a full-time job in most sports. But now they are in a position where their funding is going away. Some of them have part-time jobs, off-season jobs that are going away as everyone is being told to stay inside. They don't have jobs generally that could telecommute. So at a micro level for the athletes, there's this immediate harm, while also asking these larger questions of what happens to the large corporate sponsors. And you also have the other element of, if we go into a recession, a global recession, it's not as much of a factor for the CBC, although it is a factor for the CBC. But certainly other television partners would have to wonder too, what kind of, now a lot of these contracts are written in advance too, but things can change. But how much is advertising revenue during the games going to go down? Like, can I sell these ad spots for the same rates that I was able to before? And these sorts of questions, then, if you're not making money on the Olympics, or you're not getting the same revenues from the Olympics as you were, then future contracts with the IOC go down. Like, there's so many ripple effects to this.
Well, we could even see sports removed from the Olympics, right? There have been that precedent's been there before. Baseball was removed a couple years ago, and I'm looking at this article on CBC by Jim Morris today about what it takes to cancel the Olympics, and one of the pieces of information that's in here is that the IOC, of their income in a 4-year cycle, it says 73% comes from broadcast rights around the world. So if there is no Olympic Games to broadcast, then holy cow, you don't have a big chunk of your money that's set aside to host these games. And then if you're trying to host two of them close together, you don't have that nest egg from one of them before, it's sort of like because you still have to sustain, paying your staff and all that sort of stuff. So the big thing I see that's gonna save the Olympics is it's gonna be government money.
Yeah.
That there's no corporation is gonna stand up. I mean, I don't think, maybe I'm cynical, is gonna stand up and say, we'll pay for any losses from this Olympics.
No, and I think it's important to remember, one, can I just say this too about the International Olympic Committee? This couldn't be happening to nicer people, right? Like, they're horrible human beings, with maybe the exception of Dick Pound. But like, if you read any of the reporting about the things they put in their contracts with host cities, the things that these people require, like, it's in the contract that they're required for themselves, are insane and completely ridiculous and absolutely over the top, and they have zero regard as an organization for the host cities once they leave. They could not care less. And the International Olympic Committee does provide some money to host games, but any cost overruns is left with the city, or in most cases the federal governments end up having to pay for it. But I'm not going to cry for the International Olympic Committee. Like, the International Olympic Committee could just go away and die for all I care. Where it matters is at the level of the athletes and at the national organizations, because they're the ones who really put on the games. They're the ones who give us those great moments. And if we're in a position now where athletes can't feed their kids, that's super upsetting. But then also fiscally, at what point does it become, or does it potentially become, irresponsible for a government in the midst of a crisis to continue to put money towards sport funding?
Yeah, that's a really fair point. I think you did an episode of the History Slam, Sean, where you talked about national identity through sports.
Yeah, you were on the show. I hope What are you talking like? You say like you barely like. Oh, maybe you did. You were on the show. You were the guest.
Oh, cool. I'm plugging my own appearance. But in that, we talked a lot about how important sport is to a national identity if one even feels it. And in that sense, that's sort of how it's justified right now, right? Is putting money towards sport to promote the nationalism of being Canadian by seeing Canadians win medals and stuff. And, the CBC gives us all the stories, magazine style stories of all the athletes and that stuff. But in a world where, like you say, some people don't have enough money to feed their kids, then is it worth it putting it towards sport? I don't know what the answer is. It's above my pay grade.
And we might be getting a little ahead of ourselves, certainly, but these are questions that come up, and if I'm an Olympic athlete, particularly a Winter Olympic athlete, I think there's no question that the IOC is going to move mountains to get. Oh my goodness, what was that?
What'd you do?
Something fell.
Oh, you okay?
Yeah, I'm fine. And I'm not sure what it was that happened behind me. Oh my goodness. Sorry about that, everybody. But the IOC is going to move mountains. They make money. They make more money off the Summer Olympics than the Winter Olympics. There's no question about that. So they're going to do everything they can to get the Summer Games in. The Winter Games, I think, is where there's vulnerability, right? Corporate sponsors. If we get back to corporate sponsors like Coke, right? Major Olympic sponsor.
Yep.
And if you look at Coke's business model and where they're growing, they're trying to grow right now in places like Africa. And the Winter Olympics don't really help them in regions like Africa. So
no,
those sorts of things, lead to just an overall push towards the Summer or a preference towards the Summer Olympics than the Winter Olympics. And I will say this too for the COC. In my research today, one of the things I found is that these are the most recent I could find, which kind of bothers me. That is the most recent that I could find. But just as an example, in 2009, from 2009 to 2010. Now, obviously, the Olympics in 2010 were in Vancouver. That's going to draw a little more revenue for you. But their revenues went up by $12 million in that 1 year. So from 15 million, this is partner and marketing revenue. This is just the COC. So from $15 million in 2009 up to $27 million in 2010. Like, this is how significant these Olympic years are.
Yeah. And if you think about the athletes that we only hear about at Olympics, right? We're pretty fortunate in that we follow curling, and those athletes are sort of on display on TV in Canada pretty regularly. But athletes like downhill skiers, biathletes, there's people we never get to see compete on TV. Not to mention the Paralympics. Where it's their only chance in a lot of cases to get out and showcase their talents. So
there was an interview today with Rosie McLennan, and she's a two-time Olympic gold medalist. And I was like, oh yeah, Rosie McLennan, right? Because we see her once every 4 years for any, unless you're a big trampoline fan, which I'm sure there are trampoline fans, but she's a name that I know. And somebody who I've watched at the Olympics, but she's not an athlete she's not on Sports Center. She's not making it into the sports section of newspapers. She's not all over the CBC or anything like that. So yeah, those are the athletes that are really going to get hurt by this. And like I say, if the entirety of the board of the IOC lose their job, I'm okay with that. They're going to be fine financially based on essentially the bribes they take. to award these things, but the athletes, I shouldn't say bribes, the incentives,
Kickbacks.
yeah, like they're heavily incentivized to award to certain countries. They I don't care about them. The athletes though, and the people who organize it at a national level, a provincial level, certainly a local level, those are the people who are going to potentially get hurt by this, and that's where the concern comes from. And the logistics of having the two together is going to be tough. And I think, in the overall scheme of things, for as bad as it is for Summer Olympic athletes, it's March. It was supposed to start in July. The IOC, of course, still hasn't made that announcement. But to train and to get yourself into that peak point for July, you're well into that process right now at the end of March. So resetting it a year is going to be a very difficult task for those athletes. So again, I feel for them, but when you look at summer versus winter, I think that the people who are going to lose in this more so are going to be the winter athletes.
Yeah, I could see that definitely happening. Do you, Sean, think then, based on all of the work you've done, do you think it's likely, should the games be postponed until 2021? To me, it's looking very likely that will happen. Does your accounting sort of describe that perhaps other games will be pushed back?
I would be really surprised if that happens, just because Paris and LA are awarded, and the logistics of doing these things in those cities, it's going to be so hard. And the television partners plan out their schedules well in advance. NBC sets their whole summers around the Olympics. So I would be surprised if they get off of the even year cycle. I could see a scenario in which winter games maybe get shuffled as well. I would be stunned if they do that, but again, I think given where the money comes from and where the majority of the Olympic activity and where the Olympic movement is, I think if anything is going to be adjusted for the worse, it's going to come on the winter side of things.
Yeah, that's my feeling as well. I could see a scenario where we go back for 1 year to the two games in one calendar year
in 2022.
Yeah, I could see that. I think you're right though that they're going to push to have this in 2021. The summer is more important, like you say, financially. So,
and just even like Tokyo as a city, they've built all the athletes' village. Like the amount of money that it would cost developers to leave that sitting for a year, like just a year, is crazy. To do it for 2 years, like people are gonna rebel. Not a lot of people, the people who stand to make money off of that, but there's those factors are in play. Like, if you remember back in 2014 when the games were in Sochi, and there was, I think, rightly a lot of outcry about the Russian government's stance towards the LGBTQ plus community, and people were saying, well, just do it in Vancouver. You have the facilities, and Vancouver was like, no, we don't. The athletes' village had been dismantled and sold off. The Olympic Oval had been changed. Like the oval's still there, but the building had been changed. The curling club became the curling club. It was no longer a spectator venue. So, a lot of the infrastructure that's put in place is temporary for these events. And so Tokyo having these temporary things have to sit for a year, it's a huge logistical challenge.
Yeah, and I think when you talk about cities like Paris and LA, those cities are in a much better position to be flexible.
Yes, they are.
With
They're better equipped.
Their sort of hosting, right? Because a lot of the venues are already in place. There's transportation infrastructure in those places is there. Whether it's great or not is up for debate.
I think the people in LA might question that.
You're right. They're making progress, but so on that side, I see it as more flexible, and that's part of the reason they were awarded the games in the first place. Was nobody else wanted to do it. So, yeah, I think lots of questions are still going to come up in the next few days. We obviously are not experts, and we don't have great answers for lots of stuff, but we felt this was something we wanted to talk about. How did you think, Sean, that the announcement was made from a standpoint of publicity or whatever? I think that it was nicely coordinated. They had sort of a whole rollout planned. So obviously they didn't just wake up yesterday and go, I guess we probably shouldn't do this.
No, yeah, it was clearly well coordinated, and the media, they had reached out to everybody in the Canadian media that they needed to. So it was 100% a united front, and it was clear that while it was the COC making this announcement, it was clear that every governing body for each individual sport had been consulted, had been talked to. This, as you say, this wasn't an overnight decision. This was at least a few days in the making to get that universal approval, and also having the top line athletes, the athletes that people know, having them ready and available to speak, and also having them briefed on the talking notes from the organization. Because if you watch some of these interviews, there is remarkable consistency, not just on the messaging from the athletes, but on the way in which they are presenting that message.
Yeah, I think you're right. I just saw an article about Carl Lewis wants the games to be postponed until 2022.
Okay. To 2022.
So, yeah.
All right.
So one of the U.S.'s all-time greatest Olympic athletes there adds his voice to the conversation.
Yeah, just don't look at his whether or not he was a clean Olympic athlete.
Who cares?
Yeah, it's contested.
Yeah,
great 30 for 30 on that. I think it was a 30 for 30 on Carl Lewis.
That sounds right.
So yeah, I want to just also quickly correct myself. 2026 has been awarded, Scott, to Milan and Cortina in Italy.
Yeah, they're not that close.
Yeah, but don't they? This happens somewhat regularly, right? Where the mountain place isn't that close to where basically the indoor events are going to take place.
Yeah, I guess that's true. Right,
because how long is it to get from Vancouver, from say BC Place, to the mountains?
Hour and a half.
Right? That's not that close.
It's not that close.
How long are we looking at from Milan to Cortina?
I didn't pop up my Google Maps, but it seems far.
To
Cortina.
I'm doing it right now.
All right, this is good pod right here.
Oh wow, it's 420 kilometers.
Yeah, it's really far.
That's pretty far. All right, we ever been to Milan, Scott?
I can't say as I've had the privilege. Okay. No.
So
no.
We do know that Cortina, that's where they had the 2010 men's World Curling Championship.
Yeah, and hoping that everybody there in Italy is, taking care of themselves and doing all right.
Yes, absolutely, and certainly hope everyone, wherever you are around the world, as we said last time, follow the advice of the local and federal officials. These are like the professionals. Right? The politicians will say what the politicians say on all sides. Right? I don't know, it's not a political message. It's, listen to the doctors and the experts in this. And if we all work together and follow along, we'll get through it, Scott.
Yeah, hopefully we'll be able to go outside and play sometime soon.
At some point, yes. So, so as I said at the start, that'll be the end, unless something breaks in this that is specific to curling. I think that'll be the end of our ongoing, such as it is, Corona coverage here on the show. We have a bunch of ideas for some shows that we'll roll out over the next few weeks as this continues to stretch on, and the majority of them, Scott, are going to be, I think I would charitably describe some of these ideas as silly. Yeah. I think you sent me this long list this morning, and I read through them all, and I went, I like it. I like them all. I think they're pretty good, and yeah, more lighthearted. Yeah, definitely more lighthearted, because you can get the news of all this stuff from other sources. So we'll be here. We're gonna keep it curling centric, but as we said last time, more in the summer vein of what we do, and a little just in this environment, just a little sillier, and think outside the box of what to do. So we'll be with you the whole time through this, not physically, and we won't be physically together, but we'll be with you in spirit and in voice. Yeah. So if you want to follow along with all of that, please do subscribe to the show wherever it is you get your podcast. We are on Apple and Google and Spotify and Stitcher and all the things. So please do subscribe, rate, and let other people know about the show. And as always, you can follow along on Instagram and Twitter at Game of Stones Pod. Scott's there at Scott Likes TV, and I am at Dr. Shawnee Fever. And of course, you can email the show with ideas and suggestions, Game of Stones Podcast at gmail.com. So we'll be back with you again with a new episode in the next few days. But until then, keep your brooms on the ice, wash your hands, and don't dump that intern.
Make the final.